Welcome to our video on how to set up political theory projects. It is me, your professor, Dr. Selby. This video is called TAME because it's the acronym you will use to keep all the different things we're doing in this project sort of straight in your head. This video will be used, as many of them, at both any campus I teach at, which is currently California State University, Sacramento, and Folsom Lake College. Now, remember the online reading, which kind of takes us through this. So your political theory reader on Global Lyceum takes us through a lot of this. The Tame Method was developed by me, Professor Selby. It's a helpful mnemonic to break down arguments in a systematic manner. And then, big reminder, this is a non-adversarial style of argument. It's not about winning, it's about making a determination of the strength of an argument using the criteria of logical validity and empirical soundness, okay? Lawyers argue to win because there's a judge there who decides the case, but, there's no judge who decides in political theory, and in fact, adversarial styles of argument incentivize bad faith argumentation, which is the #1 thing we want to avoid. So TAME is the acronym and stands for Theory, Argument, Method, Evidence. Okay, so theory, what theory is being used by the author? Argument, what is the specific claim or conclusion that they are making? So remember, we call this claim making. The conclusion is the claim that they're trying to defend. Method, what method of argumentation do they use? So most of our writers are going to be doing essays, but maybe you get Herbert Hoover, who is giving a political speech, which is a little bit different from an essay. I mean, we'll treat it about the same. But internally in the structure of the essays, sometimes there's sort of like particular writing tricks or styles they're using. So Montaigne has this like clash of perspectives idea where he kind of like alternately defends different claims and then makes them smash into each other, and that's part of getting to his final claim. And sometimes students get lost in the clash of perspectives. That's all part of leading you down a certain path for the way Montaigne writes. Evidence. What evidence do they mount, and what questions should we research in defense of their claims? Evidence is the scientific part of our task. So always keep in mind, we got to keep our moral argumentation and our scientific factual analysis, causal analysis separate, right? Moral arguments go do, and they have certain normative claims and ways they're doing that. But then they frequently make claims about the real world as well. If we do this, there will be good, bad consequences. Whether it's good or bad, we need to use scientific method and scientific reasoning in order to make a determination of, are those empirical claims holding water or not, right? And then this is what we would call the is-ought distinction. Remember, is science. We use the tools of science. It's empirical claims about how the world really works. And ought is, what ought we to do? So where's the action at? The theory and method parts are pretty easy. It's usually one or two sentences, right? The action is in the argument and evidence section. For your political theory projects, you will break apart the argument of the author of that week and present it in stages. You will also do a small amount of social scientific research on an empirical question related to the argument of that week. Some of these questions might be closely tied to the argument being made by the author. Some might be, implied, and so then we want to go look at them. But it's not just going to be always easily derived from just what the author says. Sometimes easier than others. Let's put it that way. Move my little face over again. So I want an argument, the parts, okay? When we look at arguments, just like a car or something else like that, we want to take it apart and then hold each of the parts up. How's this part doing, right? And just like a car, if it's not working right, we start pulling parts off and going, are you working? Are you working? Are you working? And then when we find the part that's not working, do we just junk the car, toss out the argument? No, we fix it. You go to the store, you buy a new part, right? maybe someone put the wrong part on there to begin with, and that's why it's not working, right? Something like that. But we're always going to be try to fix an argument. Okay, we don't just chuck arguments. That's bad faith argumentation. There's one problem with your argument. Goodbye. I make it disappear. I don't like it. Too bad. Well, we don't do that in this class. Okay, that's bad faith argumentation. Oh, here's a problem with the argument, and here's how I think you can fix it. Right? That's what we're doing. The parts of an argument are called premises. The claim being established is called the conclusion. There are lots of types of premises. This is what I'm going to give you here is just, and you might want to write these down. It's going to be helpful for you. What you might want to write here, this is just a kind of like short list of the main types of premises you see. I actually did a little research, like, can I find just like a list of like the 10 most common types of premises? But people aren't systematizing as well as they really should sometimes. I mean, this is problem here is this is like intro and stuff like that. So, but anyways, lots of different types of premises, things like assumptions. So an assumption usually appears at the beginning of an argument, first or second, maybe third step if it's a longer argument. People act in fundamentally self-interested ways. That's a very common assumption we hear in like economic style arguments. Well, okay, so that actually is partially an empirical claim. So we would go appeal to empirical evidence to like judge this particular assumption. And the way this one works out is under certain conditions, saying that is great, it works, no problem. If you're a CEO of a business, you're fundamentally running your business in a self-interested way. You're fundamentally trying to maximize the profits of that business. So in economic arguments and a few other places as well, not trying to do a systematic list here, but just highlight some places where this works. Great, no problem. Like, let's have a ball and we're off and running. But if you said to me, my behavior and my family life is fundamentally self-interested, I would say, I don't know if I really see that. And I can also show you the empirical evidence where like that's just not what's happening, right? So, okay, fine, right? This is an assumption. It's going to hold under certain circumstances and not others. We just want to be aware of that. The argument's going to be a lot stronger if we're on those areas instead of others, right? And even then, maybe we can fit, okay, maybe it doesn't hold, but maybe the rest of the argument would hold if we fix that, and we can still kind of jigger it around and get to a certain conclusion, claim. I mean, okay, it's possible. Let's try to fix it. So that's an assumption. Lots of other assumptions as well. So that's just one assumption. Reason X this way, whatever. X is natural. I mean, these are all sort of like assumptions. Definitions. So definitions are hugely important in philosophy. I define justice as X. So John Rawls famously said justice is fairness, right? So it's a definition of justice. He had to kind of spell it out a little bit more there, but justice is fairness. Aristotle says justice is treating equals equally and unequals unequally, right? So like, okay, if two things are the same, we'll treat them similarly. If two things are different, we're going to treat them differently, and that's perfectly fine. So definitions, distinctions, this is not that, right? So in most of my classes, one of the early distinctions, well, is ought, distinction. Is science, ought is moral philosophy. That's the is ought distinction. That's a distinction. We've already been dealing with this, right? So, but that's great. Is ought distinction, one example of a distinction. Empirical claims. Empirical claims are anything related to the real world, right? So this is happening. This will cause that. There will be good or bad consequences. Those are all empirical claims. When we see empirical claims, instantaneously our brain needs to think science. I know I'm a broken record on some of this stuff, but it's like the repetition is actually really good for you. I promise. And then lastly, analytic claims or analytic premises. I'd like for that to say premise. Actually, let's just fix that while I'm here. Analytic premises. An analytic premise are things related to the internal structure of our arguments. So, distinctions, definitions, those are types of analytical premises. In this case, but there's more, right? So anything, definitions, distinctions, actually assumptions are usually, well, frequently they're kind of empirical as well, but it doesn't really matter. And it's okay for something to kind of be doing a little bit of work in various ways. Sometimes that'll happen. We're not going to be stressed about that. Now, when we break apart our arguments, we will label each step in the argument as a sequential premise, or as sequential premises. So premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise 4, right? Conclusion, okay? The last step is always the conclusion. Now, frequently, when we first start this, people usually want to have these like big arguments, like what's more important, the individual or the collective, right? It's like, okay, but big arguments like that are at such a high level of generality that, boy, we got to be really certain, and it's a high bar because you're talking about so many things, okay? Now, sometimes those big arguments, all the time, never kind of things, sure. I mean, if the argument works, it works. Like, that's fine. But it doesn't work all the time. And the vast majority of the time, arguments are stronger when they are more narrowly tailored to the claim being established, right? So one of the main ways we can narrow the scope of an argument is to make concessions and qualifications. Refer to chapter 2 and 3 of your online reader for thinking about putting together the arguments and making concessions and qualifications and fallacies. I talk about fallacies in chapter 3. That's helpful for criticizing these arguments as well. We will use the P1, P2, P3 conclusion method. Arguments have as many steps as needed, but never less than 3, okay? So I don't think there's any arguments out there that, when properly constructed, have less than 3 steps. Let's look at the example I put together. This one is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Okay, so Emerson is this goofy American political theorist I teach in a lot of my courses. Beautiful, brilliant guy. I think he's wrong about a lot of stuff, but he's really important and interesting. So there you go. So political theory group project. If you're at Sac State, your page might look a little bit different from this. That's fine. Here's our write-up. And then remember, I have sample project. So you got to click around a little bit to get there. But political theory project, so that's just running down the directions again. So here we are, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance. This is my name, Dr. Selby, right? Emerson's drawing from 2 main theoretical works in his theoretical tradition, in his work Self-Reliance. The first is what we call liberalism, the second American transcendentalism, and here's why we think this is the case. Notice here, what happened there? Oh, I know what happened there. Come back. Okay. And notice I've actually labeled these premises here as well, right? So you may or may not do that, but I think that's helpful for you to think through and try to think about, what is this premise? Premise 1, all of existence is unified in spirit, or what we call the oversoul. This is one of the main transcendental assumptions. Okay, this is an empirical premise actually, but it's also an assumption where he's beginning his argument. I call this pantheism, but this is part of the American transcendental style of argument. Premise 2, intuition, what Emerson refers to as spontaneous expression, is our connection to that spirit, okay, to the oversoul, to this unity of nature, okay? So it's our intuition that fundamentally connects us to this sort of larger spiritual unity. Premise 3, and so we should, I'll get there in a sec, that's the conclusion. Premise 3, forms of decision-making that are based on consequential calculation, which is ends and means, the ends justify the means, Machiavelli said, simple self-interested calculation, these kinds of things. Those aren't going to be good ways to make decisions because it's not intuition. Social custom, just what people have done forever, that's not a good way to make decisions. The esteem for others, like the desire to be seen as awesome and cool and all that, That's not a good way to make decisions, right? All of these other ways of making decisions take us away from intuition or like true self in some sense. And then the conclusion, general conclusion that he draws is self-reliance is trusting yourself to use intuition to direct and guide your actions. Living a life of principled intuition, he calls this putting sort of like principles into action. Very interesting. Living a life of principled intuition will lead to individual growth. And he seems to suggest there's like a little bit of like prosperity gospel in here, if you will, material success, okay? He portrays acting from intuition as the origin of genius. So all great things come from people who act in intuition, and a kind of almost like godlike nobility, because intuition is that thing that connects us with this larger sort of like spiritual world. And so when we act from intuition, we're acting in our spiritual nature, which is a godlike, a spiritual-esque way of behavior. And he also associates this with a certain form, with like a modern kind of notion of nobility, right? Of being higher, of living according to a higher set of rules and laws and regulations and things. Now, from this general conclusion, so that's kind of like the general conclusion, but then he spins out, some very particular conclusions that he wants to be quite clear about. So first, you can't just pray, okay? Prayer is useless. So too is regret, feeling bad about mistakes. Intellectual creeds are do this, don't do that, these kind of like systematic ways of constructing behavior. That doesn't work. What works is what he calls prayer in action, okay? Which is taking actions that uphold your beliefs, your intuition beliefs, right? So you actually have to take actions that matter. So prayer in action. 2, cultivate yourself and your individuality at home. You don't need to travel to Europe to figure out who you are. You don't need to go to Jamaica to get your groove back, right? There was this funny movie years ago, how Stella got her groove back. I never saw it. I don't see any movies hardly. But, it's like she's in a rut. She goes to Jamaica, meets a hot guy. She got her groove back, right? That actually doesn't sound that bad. But according to Emerson, it's not going to work. So maybe he's wrong. 3, imitation. So this is also kind of like part of the custom doesn't work kind of thing. Doing things because other people did it is not going to work. You have to be an individual, break the mold, do it in your own way, okay? So imitation is false action. 4, and then there's this kind of like A and B kind of like conclusion here is what I put here. Social progress of technology is dangerous to the development of intuition. Only individual progress is truly possible. So, we all think a lot like, oh, internet is progress and it's great and everything's wonderful. Emerson would be skeptical of that. And as skeptical as I am of most of the claims he makes in this piece, that's one that I probably agree with him about. So keep that in mind. It's kind of interesting. 4b, property and material possessions are also a danger to self-reliance because you end up making decisions based upon just maintaining your stuff or getting more stuff. Materialism is a real threat to him. Okay? And then method, evidence. We'll return and look at this evidence piece here in a second. Okay? But I'm going to go back to my slides from current slide. Okay? Actually, I should have put this before I went and did it, but this is my second time around the video, so I'm not going to go back because I'm 20 minutes in. So return to concession and qualification. I should have done this before I went and did the example, but here we are. It's my second time through this video. I'm not doing it again. Concession is the acknowledgement of a weakness or problem in an argument. Okay. After conceding a point, you should try to reframe the argument in a narrow way. So you're going to try to fix it, right? Okay, I concede that this piece of the car isn't working. Let's try to fix it. So I concede that self-interest is not the only source of human motivation, but in economic life, it rises to the fore and is therefore an acceptable assumption under the conditions of free market capitalism, right? It's kind of what I said before, just in a fancier way. And I think that's probably true. I mean, that seems to make sense to me. Let's put it that way. Qualification is qualifying your argument, meaning you recognize the limits of what you're trying to argue. So this argument applies under X conditions, not universally. The Bushido is a useful system of ethics under conditions of Japanese feudalism, but can have dangerous consequences if applied in other types of social systems. I mean, maybe, maybe not. I actually wouldn't fully agree with that argument, but I completely understand why someone would say that. So keep that in mind. So I want to give us a little more philosophical vocabulary here. So I got to move myself around a little bit. That's good enough. A short list of some extra things we want to sort of like keep in mind. So philosophers hold ideas. Why do we use the language hold? Because if you hold something, you hold it up and you're looking at it and you can turn it around, right? It's not a belief that's uncriticized, that just sits, kind of doing its work without ever being looked at, right? You hold it up to the light and you look at it and you move it around. How's this thing working, okay? So whether that's a claim, a premise, right, hold is used a whole lot. Philosophers also think, argue, and defend, okay? But they don't believe. Like, belief is not a word that we use in philosophy very frequently, or political theory very frequently, exactly because these things need to be looked at and defended. I mean, like, religious beliefs are things that you take having a lot less evidence. Let's just put it that way, right? Principle of generosity. This is a key one that is really important in political theory. The principle of generosity means we take arguments at their best version, not at their worst. This is why we try to fix things, why we're very nice and kind, and we construct arguments in their strongest form, not their weakest form. The opposite of the principle of generosity is frequently called the straw man fallacy, where someone constructs a kind of caricature of an argument, and then because they put it together in such a bad way, they then magically discover that this is a bad argument and we can chuck it out, right? But I mean, like, that's everything we're not going to do, right? And like, I do mean kind of like a caricature of an argument, right? So if you've ever been, at the fair or the pier, there's places, there's artists who sit there and they'll do a caricature of you. They make your chin really big, whatever. They kind of draw you in these cartoony kind of ways. That's what I'm referring to. When people put together arguments in ways that you recognize them, but they're clearly exaggerated for a reason, we're not going to do that, right? So we're not looking for that kind of caricature. We're looking for a good characterization, right? Important difference here. Secondly, the principle of reciprocity is one of the key elements in political theory and moral philosophy, which, like the principle of generosity, is often undervalued. The same arguments, evidence, and criteria we use to judge other people's arguments can and will be used to judge our arguments, right? So, it comes up a lot. Conservatives in the U.S., they say, oh, well, Gulag was terrible, Russia, Stalin was a bad guy, communism, is bad. Like, okay, fair enough. And then problem being, capitalism is not immune from being mean either. And so, well, death squads, right? Like through South America, there's all kinds of capitalist governments that were indiscriminately just murdering their own citizens. Like, say what you will about communism, like, at least they sent you to the gulag and gave you a shot. They had a few show trials, but at least you had a show trial. I'm talking death squads just walking through the countryside, randomly shooting people. Like, that's really extra bad. And so I'm both, I'd like to go on the record here, as being both against the gulag and against death squads. I know, taking a major stand, I know, like, oh, Professor Selby says death is something to be avoided. But I really mean that. And we got to be careful. Like, if that's the criteria we're going to use, we might not have anybody left, right? So think about that. Okay. Almost like a little Trump kind of look. Nothing against Trump. I just kind of randomly happen to make a funny face. Just a little more philosophical vocabulary I want you to have locked in your brain. Objection, right? Objections are evaluative statements that seek to demonstrate a fallacy or weakness or other kind of problem with an argument. Your political theory projects will look at objections as well. Response after an objection, principle of generosity, we're going to try to fix the argument with a response. Okay, so a statement or reformulation of an argument to address an objection. The other thing arguments will do, and we'll see this when we get to John Locke. This is one of my John Locke exercises, really helps us think through this sort of question. But moral theories, moral philosophy theories, or normative theories, one of the main things they do is they're like, you're allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that, right? So we have this three-part distinction here, actually. Morally required, you have to do this. Morally permissible, you may do this if you so choose. Morally impermissible, you are absolutely positively not allowed to do this, right? So, and arguments, you almost always sort things into these three categories. Like, here's things you have to do, here's things you can do if you want to, and here's things you absolutely cannot do, okay? There we go. And then quick return to Tame. What is your, what are your political theory projects going to look like overall? Remember the model on Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm going to go look at the objection and response part for us very briefly, but oops, that should be 5 parts. Fix this. They have 5 parts. Political theory projects have 5 parts. And the 5 parts are, you can do them in slightly different orders, like 1 and 2 could be reversed, or you could move 1 other places. But for the most part, they're mostly going to kind of follow in this similar sort of order like this. So a qualitative summary is just a normal written summary of the argument. 2 to 3 paragraphs summarizing without doing P1, P2, P3, just kind of like writing up this is what the author is arguing. 2, then you're going to do P1, P2, P3, P4. You're going to tame the argument. 3, you're going to look at examples of objections and responses. So you want to come up with, here's some, and we want to get good objections too, right? So another place people go wrong is they don't come up with good, I mean, maybe it's that great of an argument and there's no good objections, but that's pretty rare actually. People have objections and we want to get them, find them, try to think through them, and then think through how the author would respond. 4, research 1 to 2 empirical claims related to the argument. And then 5, come up with some discussion questions for the class. These discussion questions could be used live, they could be used online, depending on the format of the class. And lastly, and then I'll go look at my Emerson example one more time. What outside sources should you use? Well, first, when you're doing your empirical research bit, you're going to use my quick guide to social science research. That's a really good, reliable way to make pretty good determinations about empirical claims. Okay, it's not perfect, but it's one of the fastest and most reliable ways I can boot you up to do pretty good social science research. So if you should pay attention to this, because this would be helpful in like any class. And if you did this method in like some other class, or you like really, especially what I call triangulation, which will be for a later video, but if you do like triangulation, like, oh man, like any professor, social science professor, if you do it accurately and you say, I was taught this method and it goes like this and let me do it for you, so kind of explain it to them. If you're writing an essay, they're going to just like love it. They're going to just, oh my God, that's amazing. You're gonna get A+ and happy faces and stars and hearts and, I don't know, unicorns with all the colors. My son, he's 4, right? So he's into unicorns, and he's like, I want a unicorn with wings and all the colors and magical powers. And then also sometimes he puts swords on the wings because the unicorn needs to fight. I'm like, okay, dude, you have whatever kind of unicorn you want. But use the quick guide to social science research, okay? So and that's going to show you how to, right? It's going to send you to certain empirical sources. It works great. It's a wonderful method. Get good at this method and you are going to be cruising in your academic career. Second, when you're trying to figure out what the heck these guys are saying, you're more than welcome to use various online sources trying to figure out what they're saying. I want you to try to do it on your own first, because there's so much value in trying to like think through the ideas on your own before you go look for other people's answers. And whatever you do, just be aware there's multiple ways of putting together what these guys are saying. And so if you go online, you might not get a very good version, right? So if you're looking for help, please come to me, number one. It's absolutely okay to go online. Whatever sources you use, cite them, okay? And even if you barely use it or don't even really use it, I'd rather see you cite more than less. It actually looks good for you. Like, you know, even if you don't cite it, you looked at it, it was part of your research process. You know, maybe it didn't, maybe you thought it was wrong even, but it looks good. Like, here's the thing I looked at, I thought it was wrong, so we didn't really use it, but it's there. Just cite all the sources you use, okay? Like, that's like so critical, number one. And then before I go look at my project again a little bit more for you, groups need to meet with me the week before their final thing is due. And, you know, hopefully you've read it. Hopefully you have a rough cut at some of it. I'm not, I really just want to make sure we check in and then I can help you and I can guide you, okay? So preferably you have a first shot at taming the argument, a few objections and responses, and an empirical question you want to look at. You know, depending on the class, especially earlier groups, we're kind of getting you going and you might not be working ahead yet as much. So that's fine, not a big deal. But, you know, proposals should have these things. Now let's go look at, as I said we would, at my Emerson one again, okay? So here's my qualitative summary of Emerson's argument. And I kind of put my objections in there. So the format here is, you know, you could vary this format a little bit, but you need those 5 things that I referred to. So one objection is Emerson is too harsh on social custom and perhaps also the esteem of others. Like, I mean, I'm probably willing to give him the materialism piece, so there you go. But I mean, like, you look at America today, which is very different from Emerson's time when conformity was pretty high, but everyone's like, oh, we should all be individuals. And everyone, like, agrees we should all be individuals. Well, okay, so now we're being individuals because our social custom is we should all be individuals, and that's how that argument looks, and I think there's some truth to that. So then a real individual is one who rejects individuality or something. I don't know. Now we're in this kind of like funny space. Well, maybe there's some elements of social custom or even acting out of the desire to be seen as favorable by others that can actually be conducive to individuality. I mean, look at musicians, right? Great, someone, Jimi Hendrix, like, wow, he's an amazing musician, but he also wants to be up there on stage with people loving him and adoring him and being amazed at his musicianship. Does that mean he's less of an individual because he was partially motivated by the desire to be on stage and have all that adoration? Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think we should allow at least a little bit of social custom and desire to be esteemed means loved or thought well of by others. So, I think that there's maybe something there. Now, I also think that Emerson's argument can be relatively easily fixed here by making a distinction. So Emerson in this case is going to make a concession. Yes, Selby, this is a good objection. Maybe I was too harsh on social custom and some of these other things. And notice how I even put together my objection. I conceded or qualified, depending on how you want to look at this one, that I think he's probably right about the materialism. I just think he's wrong about this. So my objection is kind of narrowly focused as well. Now you can say, okay, Selby, yeah, we're going to make a distinction between social customs or other types of, desire for esteem, between those that are conducive to people becoming more individualistic and those that are contrary to that. And so by making this distinction, we can still, the whole argument works. We've just tinkered with it, and now we've said, okay, there are some social customs that will pass the test and some won't. Objection 2 here actually comes from this guy Tocqueville. I don't want to, briefly explain it to you. When I initially put this together, I was having a Tocqueville reading as a a sort of rejoinder to Emerson. Some classes still have that dropped out in some classes. So, but just, trust me, it's there. But Tocqueville says, like, look, your everything is spirit sort of assumption. It doesn't lead people to take action. It leads them to be passive, because they start to believe that everything is determined by this higher being, right? Who controls everything. And so your actions don't matter. It doesn't matter what you do. There's some larger logic that's happening. And so you can just kind of become passive and just not take action. So Tocqueville's actually really worried about that. Tocqueville thinks it's a big criticism. Emerson might have a response to it. I don't want to get too hung up on it. And then objection 3, this is really kind of interestingly, as much as he's like being individual and everything like that, it's almost kind of oddly self-centered way of sort of leads to some odd self-centered kind of like conclusions, and it's a little bit egotistical in a way. I think it's like it's a very self-regarding sort of theory. And he says he says at one point, well, do I have to give to help other people? Like, are they my poor? I mean, do we owe anything to anybody? I mean, does self-reliance mean we can leave our families, leave society at large to itself while we just pursue our own personal projects of spontaneous expression, right? Like, sorry, I can't pull you out of the gutter. I'm too busy, being an artist. It's going to pull me down to help you. Like, maybe, but seems kind of weird. There's something kind of cold in his approach to others. Like, is compassion really that bad? Certainly our obligations to our families require us, don't they? Require us to do basic things like go to work, compromise over how we spend our time, etc. And these turn out to be, if you ask people, very important obligations that actually make them very happy. This is actually kind of probably the biggest problem with his argument here. Are there sort of like unchosen or semi-chosen, not just, I did it, not just kind of like spontaneous expression, but other things that really are valuable that count? These things could even be part of our individuality. So he constructs his argument as like these things are like anti-individualistic, but maybe the type of family we grew up in, maybe where we're from, all of those types of things are part of our individuality. That's very possible. The poor may indeed be Emerson's poor. Oh, let me put this here. The poor may indeed be Emerson's poor, may indeed not be Emerson's poor. Excuse me, there should be a not there. But at the very least, they are our poor, and we collectively share some responsibility for having created a situation that negatively harmed them, right? For example, and this is, you want to see the empirical evidence here, I'd more than happily provide it for you. The homeless crisis in the United States today is largely a result of choices we made basically mostly back in the 80s that led to a massive increase in cost of housing, that's buying or renting, and reduced mental health services. So, not all people who are homeless have mental health issues, but about a third of them do, which is a large number. And all of them could use someplace to stay. And it's a problem because they don't have money to pay for it. And the cost of housing has gone up, right? And one of the things we see, I know a little bit about homelessness, has become clear. And one of the things that happens is, at first families double up. You pack more and more people into these smaller spaces, but at some point something's got to give, and then whoever is renting or paying, they say like, look, man, you have to go. You've been here for X amount of time. You just can't stay here anymore. But they don't have someplace to go, and they end up on the street. The housing crisis, which is a result of various development decisions, there's 4 or 5 different decisions we made starting in the, back to the 70s, really 80s, but, some in the 70s that have sort of led to the housing crisis. So we also have a housing crisis. Well, the housing crisis and the homeless crisis are related, right? I think they are to some extent our poor. Like, if we made decisions that made it harder for people to have houses and now they're homeless, maybe we should make different decisions that make it easier for them to have houses so they don't have to be homeless. Call me crazy. I'm crazy. Okay. So that's just that's where I'll finish off there. Bring this back up for us, right? There you go. That's the video.